Welcome to Hollywood Recaps. In today's video, we will be looking at a romantic comedy named Just Like Heaven. Fair warning, there are spoilers ahead. The film opens with a stellar shot of a beautiful garden in San Francisco. We see Elizabeth sitting at the center, enjoying its peace and serenity. Unfortunately, this was just a dream, as her coworker abruptly wakes her up from her 6-minute nap. After learning that Elizabeth has been working for 23 hours, Dr. Fran, Elizabeth's boss, advises her to go home. Elizabeth refuses, as she really wants to move ahead in her career as a doctor. As she gets back to work, she runs into her coworker, Brett, who is a jerk to her. Elizabeth shakes it off, and starts effortlessly dealing with patients all over the hospital. Elizabeth is a very good doctor. She's kind, smart, and she's extremely productive. But, she is so involved in work that she doesn't have time for a love life. While she's still at the hospital, Elizabeth gets a call from her sister, Abby. Abby has set her up on a blind date, and, with a little persuasion, Elizabeth agrees to be there. After getting the good news that she earned her promotion, she sets off for Abby's place. But, while driving there, she gets into a serious accident. David, who is looking for an apartment in San Francisco, is not liking any of them. After being tormented by a piece of paper blowing in the wind, David finally takes a look at it, only to realize that it's an ad for an apartment across the street. And as fate would have it, David decides to rent it. After living there for a short time, David is startled when Elizabeth seemingly appears out of nowhere. Elizabeth insists that the apartment that he is living in is actually hers, and accuses David of being some homeless man that sneaked in. They continued to debate the issue when Elizabeth suddenly disappeared. Later, David tells his friend Jack about it, who reminds David that he was drunk when this happened, so it's probably a hallucination. He tells David to stop his isolated lifestyle and start living life. It turns out that David has been like this for 2 years. Back at the apartment, Elizabeth shows up once again, spooking David. She tells him that she is going to call the police if he doesn't leave the house. But as she reaches for the phone, her hand phases through it. When she goes to get the kitchen phone, she disappears yet again. The next day, David goes to a spiritual bookstore. Daryl, the store employee who is very in tune with the supernatural, recommends some books for David. The books are useless, but after some talking and arguing, David manages to convince Elizabeth that she is a spirit. What's more, Elizabeth can't remember anything about herself. At first, Elizabeth tries her best to annoy David out of the apartment. In response, and out of desperation, David gets back at her by hiring many paranormal professionals to get rid of her spirit. All of them were posers, so David finally calls Daryl, the bookstore employee, for help. As it turns out, he actually has some kind of gift that allows him to feel spirits. Unfortunately, Daryl can't help David, because Elizabeth's spirit feels very much alive. Before leaving, Daryl mentions that David's aura is the darkest he has ever seen. Elizabeth makes fun of this, assuming that he was dumped by a previous girlfriend. Daryl then tells David to move on from the loss. He also tells Elizabeth to have respect for the dead. Elizabeth learns that the cause of David's alcoholism and isolation is due to the grief of losing his wife. She apologizes for making fun of him and asks if he wants to talk about it, but David doesn't. He finally tells Elizabeth that his wife's name was Laura, then leaves. David goes down to the bar to drown his sorrows, but Elizabeth follows him, persisting that this is not healthy. David ignores her, so she possesses his body to stop him, causing a ruckus. Everyone now thinks David is crazy, so he leaves. David is sitting on a park bench when Elizabeth shows up. She asks, "Why are you the only one who can see me? When I'm not with you, it's like I don't exist? Maybe I am dead." They share a moment together and David decides to help her get to the bottom of these mysteries. The next day, David asks some of the other tenants in his apartment building about Elizabeth. Strangely, nobody knows anything about her. They think nobody lived there. When David meets an attractive neighbor, Katrina, she tells him that a girl lived there, but she was totally antisocial. As David is about to leave, Katrina makes advances toward him. However, he decides to not reciprocate her advances. Elizabeth thinks Katrina was a bit trashy. Maybe Elizabeth was getting a little jealous? Back at the apartment, David manages to find an old note written by Elizabeth. It has an address written on it, with either the number 425 or 426. David can't tell because, as you know, Elizabeth is a doctor and bad handwriting comes with the territory. Elizabeth says it's 425. They go to the address, and when they knock, a middle-aged man answers. David describes Elizabeth's appearance to him. It turns out, the man is cheating on his wife, and he thinks David is a private investigator describing his mistress. He offers David money to keep his mouth shut about this. The situation makes Elizabeth think she was sleeping with a married man, which she was not. In reality, they were at the wrong house. The real address was 426, which was Dr. Fran's house. They leave, and on their search, they end up in a restaurant. While there, a waiter suddenly falls down and stops breathing. Elizabeth tells David to get close, and guides him through the procedure that saves the waiter's life. Elizabeth finally remembers that she was a doctor, so they decide to go to the hospital where she worked. There, David inquires about her with the receptionist. She tells him that he needs to speak with Dr. Fran. David tells Dr. Fran that he is Elizabeth's boyfriend. Otherwise, a hospital wouldn't have disclosed anything. Fran reluctantly believes David, and tells him about Elizabeth's accident. As it turns out, Elizabeth has been in a coma for 3 months. Elizabeth is sad, but David reassures her by telling her that being in a coma is far better than being dead. Although she can't get into her own body, her spirit feels David's hand when he touches hers. That means she is still connected. Elizabeth stays at the hospital while David goes home. Soon afterward, Abby shows up at the hospital to visit Elizabeth with her kids. Brett, the jerk from earlier, who was promoted in place of Elizabeth, tells Abby that they have to unplug Elizabeth's life support because she was against artificially prolonging life. But they need some signatures from Abby. Abby says, "I'll think about it," and leaves. David is now at home eating dinner, when Katrina, the neighbor, shows up saying she is locked out of her apartment. She attempts to seduce David, when Elizabeth shows up, making things awkward. David lets her know that he has nothing to do with it. Elizabeth encourages him to accept Katrina's advances, and leaves. David refuses and goes up to the roof, to see Elizabeth. On the rooftop, David opens up to Elizabeth about his wife and they bond. We find out that David used to be a landscape architect, and that the garden Elizabeth saw in her dream, at the beginning of the film, is real and is actually David's work. Suddenly he gets a call. They are pulling the plug on Elizabeth's life support. The pair rushes to Abby's home, where David tries to convince her that she shouldn't allow the doctors to let Elizabeth die. Meanwhile, Elizabeth notices that her niece, Lily, can see her. Abby tells David that she wanted to respect Elizabeth's wishes, and that it's too late, since she has already signed the papers. As a last resort, David tells her the truth about how he can see Elizabeth's spirit. Understandably, Abby thinks he is crazy. She overreacts and pulls a knife to protect her children from the crazy man. But after David leaves, her daughter, Lily, mentions Elizabeth, making Abby rethink her reaction. Elizabeth has lost hope, but David is still persistent in making sure she stays alive. Elizabeth thinks no one would believe them, so, as a last resort, they go to Daryl, the only person who knows this is real. Daryl is not much help. His only input is that Elizabeth has feelings for David, as if that wasn't obvious. At home, David is anxious to save Elizabeth. He is thinking of all the different ways, but Elizabeth just tells him how they are not going to work. David wonders, what is Elizabeth's unfinished business in this world? Elizabeth wishes that she had lived her life to the fullest. David tells her that there is still time, that he can take her anywhere in the world, do anything she wants. Elizabeth replies, "I want only one thing." They both lie down on the bed, face to face. They can't touch each other, but they can still feel each other ever so slightly. Elizabeth realizes what her unfinished business in this world is. It's David. They're both finally honest with their feelings for each other. The next morning, David exclaims that Elizabeth has saved him from his loathing, and now it's his turn to save her. He is going to steal Elizabeth's body from the hospital. But for that, he would need help. He pulls up to the hospital in a van, with his friend, Jack, who has no idea what's going on. When Jack asks what's happening, David tells him that his hallucinations from before were not really hallucinations. Jack tests him by holding different signs behind his back. Elizabeth tells David, and they pass the strange test. Jack then asks, "Why are you doing this?" David finally tells Elizabeth that he loves her, and Elizabeth tells him, "No one has ever said that to me before." When they arrive at Elizabeth's bed, Jack realizes that she is the girl that he tried to set up with David 3 months earlier. So David was the blind date Abby set up for Elizabeth, on the night of the accident. They were meant to find one another. Jack and David, dressed up as doctors, try to use the portable ventilator to take Elizabeth's body out of the hospital. Brett stands in the way, so David punches him and they try to escape with security, Fran and Abby in pursuit. Jack tackles one of the security guards, who accidentally removed Elizabeth's breathing tube. While running with the stretcher, David is surrounded and trapped. Elizabeth's heart monitor begins to flatline. She is dying, and her spirit is disappearing. David attempts to resuscitate her, but he's tackled and pulled away by security. Suddenly Elizabeth's monitor begins beeping again, and she awakens from her coma. It's a miracle. Sadly, Elizabeth doesn't recognize David, nor does she have any memory of all the events that took place while she was in the coma. Elizabeth is released from hospital, and returns to her apartment. She goes up to the roof of the building, which has been turned into a beautifully landscaped garden. David is working on it. He explains that he got in with a spare key that Elizabeth's spirit had shown him previously. Just as he is about to leave, Elizabeth asks for her key back. As he gives her the key, their hands touch, and Elizabeth's memory of the events during her coma come flooding back to her. And finally, they kiss, leaving their future to our imagination. Thanks for watching. If you want more great movie recaps like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel, And click that bell notification so you never miss out. That's all for today. I'll see you again next time.